This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, a golden ticket Warhammer 40k event being held March 8th and 9th, 2025. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of Ridiculous Rules. We're going to take a rules concept and break it down in excruciating detail. And today, I'm going to cover something that I've already talked about on this series, but has gotten a lot of questions and some updates in recent times. The rules for line of sight, and especially how they pertain to ruins. Now, as always with this video series, I'm going to talk about the rules as written. If your local community chooses to play the rules in a different way, that's totally fine. I'm not here to judge how you play Warhammer 40k, but if you were to go to a competitive event or into a new metagame, this is how I would expect these rules to be played. So with that, let's talk about a basic overview of Warhammer 40k's line of sight mechanics. Warhammer uses a mechanic called true line of sight. This essentially means that you're drawing lines of sight between the individual models in each other's armies by tracing imaginary lines between the miniatures. Functionally, this means that you trace a line from any point on your miniature or the base of your miniature to the entirety of the other mini. This is going to end up being kind of like a cone. If any of that cone can reach the other miniature without crossing through any other models, terrain features, or over ruined terrain, which we'll discuss later on in the video, you have line of sight. You have partial line of sight if any of those lines end up becoming blocked. And if all of the lines are blocked, then you don't have line of sight at all. So by way of example here, let's jump into Tabletop Simulator and discuss the line of sight from this Land Raider. Now, as we can see, we're trying to draw a line of sight to these ultramarine intercessors that are hiding in this ruin over here. And when we do so, we're going to choose a point on the Land Raider to draw a line of sight from. Usually that'll be a point on the sides or an outstretched area where you can get the most angle. You do this each time you draw a line of sight to a miniature, but in this case, it'll be easy just to choose one point on the model. In this case, if we're drawing line of sight from this Land Raider, we can draw it from its outstretched weapon over here. I'm just going to trace lines across the battlefield to describe the line of sight. As we can see, two of the intercessors are entirely out in the open. Nothing besides other models is blocking line of sight to them, and that doesn't typically count for anything. However, one of our intercessors is hiding partially behind a wall. That means this model would be partially obscured from the Land Raider's line of sight. This typically matters for cover. On the flip side, there are two more intercessors that are entirely behind this wall, and if we are drawing line of sight from this Land Raider, there is no line that can reach the intercessors from the Land Raider, any point of the intercessors at all, that doesn't pass through this solid object. So line of sight to these models will be blocked. Now, it's important to note that these lines can be drawn from any point to or from your miniature, regardless of where your base is and how you measure your base. So some models, like Magnus the Red here, well, they do use their base for measurement, so measurements to and from that model are going to be traced only from the base. Line of sight can be traced from anywhere, so we can use outstretched parts like this staff or his wings, for example, to draw line of sight. But keep in mind that this is both a blessing and a curse. Well, it's much easier for him to get line of sight to other models. It's also much easier for other models to get line of sight to him, since they can achieve at least partial line of sight simply by drawing that line of sight to any part of the model. Now, what does line of sight actually give you? If you have partial line of sight to any model in a unit, you can target that unit with ranged attacks. Even models that are not necessarily in line of sight can potentially be the subject of that attack. So for example, if Magnus could only see in this instance this one intercessor, even though he's only partially visible, his attacks could potentially be assigned to the intercessors back here. The defending player always assigns incoming damage to their unit or incoming saving throws, and they have to continuously assign saving throws that come in until that model is dead. So even though these models are out of line of sight of Magnus, he'd still be able to affect them with his attacks because he has partial line of sight to at least one model in the unit. Partial or blocked line of sight will oftentimes grant you cover from terrain features, so if you're playing with a specific type of terrain, just go ahead and check the core rules to make sure that being obscured by it grants you that cover bonus. And in this video, we're going to discuss ruined terrain in great detail, which does grant cover to models obscured by it. Next, we're going to talk about moving around terrain. But first, sponsor time. The Ides of March are approaching, and you should beware of missing the Ides of March GT held by Treasure Trove Keep on March 8th through 9th, 2025. This is the second year that the Ides of March Grand Tournament will be running, and if you are just hearing about it for the first time ever, it is a 100-player GT held up in Rockport, Maine. The event is held at the Samoset Resort, an absolutely gorgeous location, taken from me as someone who was there last year. Oh my god, the location is incredible. You get wonderful views and beautiful weather while you're playing some Warhammer 40k. In addition to a 5-round Warhammer 40k GT, there is also a 100-player AOS event if you're more of a fantasy connoisseur. There is also the Ides of March Golden Brush painting competition that is judged by none other than Goobertown Hobbies. So if you don't want to be a goober yourself, you should head on over to treasuretrovekeep.com/Ides of March 2025 and go get yourself a ticket. I'll also be there at the event live streaming, so you can catch coverage of it here on the channel, but really I would rather see you on camera in person at the tournament. So get your tickets today and I'll see you there. Now let's take a break from line of sight talk real quick here and talk about moving in regards to terrain. Generally speaking, models can't move through solid terrain features, with some exceptions. Some specific types of terrain will allow models to traverse through them, but especially larger monsters and vehicles will basically have to navigate around terrain features in order to successfully traverse them. It's important to note, however, that you ignore terrain features that are less than 2 inches in height while moving. So for example, in this case, we've determined that these statues are less than 2 inches tall, which means that when a model is moving, it can entirely ignore them. As long as it doesn't end its movement on top of that terrain feature, you can move through it without any penalty. I should note, however, that this determination is made using the full height of that terrain feature, not the height of each individual portion of it. So a small portion of a terrain feature that's greater than 2 inches in height would not be normally passable using this rule. That said, in some cases, terrain features will be too large or impassable for your models to get around, and at that point we do something that's called parkouring or climbing terrain. You're allowed to move vertically to traverse terrain. You simply have to pay the vertical distance moved in order to do so. So for example, this impulsor is too wide to get through this gap right here, meaning that in order to legally cross this area, it would have to move over the terrain feature. In this case, we can see that each side of this wall is about 2.5 inches tall, so the impulsor would need to move 2.5 inches up and 2.5 inches down in order to clear this terrain feature, essentially adding 5 inches vertically to its movement. In that case, that would make this move essentially an 11-inch move. Now, importantly, while this does seem conceptually kind of weird because you have a tank that's moving directly up a wall, you can't end this movement mid-climb, and generally speaking, especially large units like tanks and other vehicles, can't end the movement on the second story or above the ground level of most terrain features, so this movement is basically just representing them ramming or busting through that wall. This means that they're able to knock over and move through short and stubby terrain features, but anything larger will be a little bit too tough for them and they'll have to go around. Keep in mind though that the game does consider you to be physically moving over the terrain feature. So for example, if the impulsor was a larger model, it would have to pay additional movement, or in some cases be unable to move over terrain that was too tall for it. In this case, this would be about an 11-inch addition to its movement if it was to try to get through the terrain this way. Now the impulsor in this situation is a particular example because it uses hull measurement, so it essentially counts its entire model as its base. However, a model like Magnus the Red that is not a vehicle and comes with a base uses base measurement, as we mentioned before, and interacts with terrain quite differently. Models that use base measurement like this are essentially determined to act more fluidly on the battlefield and not be quite as restricted by the pose and the physicality of their actual miniature. This means that they are able to traverse through terrain features with portions of their model that are not their base. So for example, the outstretched parts like wings and spears and weapons and things like that, while performing a move, as long as they don't end that movement in a position where they are intersecting the area of that terrain feature. So essentially, models like Magnus can only be restricted by terrain that is too small for his base to fit through. In this case, and just for demonstration purposes here, Magnus is able to traverse his base through the gap in this terrain, but as we can see, in doing so, his spear spear and wing would have to pass through the terrain feature. This is perfectly legal, and this means that this terrain does not impede his movement as long as he doesn't end his movement in a position where he is clipping through the terrain. So for example, he can't end with his spear extending through the wall like this. However, if he's able to move far enough that his spear doesn't do that, then that is a perfectly legal placement. So the terrain feature in this case is large enough for Magnus to be able to pass through without penalty as long as he has a space to stretch his wings at the beginning and the end of that movement. Now, Magnus also flies, which gives us an opportunity to talk about through the air movement. Essentially, if Magnus were to traverse vertically a terrain feature, instead of moving to the edge of the terrain, then moving vertically up and down the terrain before completing his movement, he is going to move diagonally to the top of that terrain. So in this case, you would measure the literal three-dimensional distance on a diagonal from the edge of the model space to the lip of the terrain feature. In this case for Magnus, that would be about 6 inches. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and stage a proxy Magnus up at that point of the movement. So this would be about 6 inches of movement for Magnus to get up to this point. Then, as long as he has the movement to then clear the wall by moving along it and then down diagonally to wherever he wants to end his movement, that is how he would end up measuring that move. So this would be about a 6-inch move. It would cost him about 4 inches of movement to clear the wall with his base. That's measured horizontally because he has to move such that his base doesn't pass through the terrain. Again, you can't pass through the terrain with your base while moving. Then it would be probably another 7 inches to move down. So in this case, this would only be about a 17-inch move, which is actually not that difficult for Magnus the Red. He's actually able to clear that in an advance pretty easily. Now, it's also important to note that generally speaking, you can't end these movements on the upper levels of terrain features. There are some specific units and terrain types that have an exception to this. For example, if you have a ruined terrain feature with a floor, like a second level, and you are an infantry or beast model, you're able to climb up through the floor and then occupy that second floor. Flying models can also do that, so Magnus, if you had a second floor on this terrain feature, could potentially end his movement up there. But an important thing to note is that you do need to end movement with the entirety of your base overlapping that floor of the terrain feature. So a position like this wouldn't be legal. We would have to have a huge platform for Magnus to stand on in order for him to end his movement there. Otherwise, he's going to have to move over it, just in the way that we described previously. We had a solid couple minutes not discussing 40k's line of sight rules, but that is over now because we're going to talk about cover, being in cover, and gaining cover. Now, what is cover in Warhammer 40,000? It's a status granted by many terrain features, as well as some special effects and special rules. Most notably, being partially obscured by many terrain features will grant you cover, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail once we talk about ruins in more depth. And when a model is benefiting from cover, it gets +1 to its armor save with a single caveat. It does not, after AP is applied, improve a 3+ save to a 2+ save. Now, this is a little confusing, so I'll explain it in greater detail. Essentially, if you're taking any hits from an AP0 weapon and you have a 3+ save already, cover doesn't apply to you. However, in any other situation, you gain cover. This means that cover can functionally improve a save to better than a 2+, but it's important to remember that a roll of 1 always fails. So a 2+ save that's in cover would theoretically be a 1+ save. However, you're still going to fail on the roll of a 1. What it will let you do, though, is essentially ignore the first point of AP of an enemy model attacking you, because it's going to reduce your 1+ save to a 2+ save, which is mathematically the same. Now let's go back to our Intercessor squad and our Land Raider here to discuss who actually gains cover in a lot of these situations. First of all, if you are obscured by the terrain feature, so you're either partially obscured like this Intercessor is, or you're totally obscured like the two in the side are, or you are wholly within the area of the terrain feature, which these two models are, you will gain cover. Now this Intercessor, as we can see, is partially outside the terrain feature. You're wholly within as long as the entirety of your base is overlapping the footprint of that terrain, and he's edged out a little bit here, so he wouldn't gain cover from the ruin terrain naturally. However, if we look from the Land Raider's perspective, he is partially behind the wall, and that means that he is partially obscured by the ruin and he would gain cover. However, these two models are not. This means that when the Land Raider goes to attack this Intercessor squad, any hits assigned to these two models are going to not receive that +1 saving throw bonus. However, any hits assigned to these three models are. That said, cover is applied to models in a unit if that line of sight gets blocked from any member of the attacking unit. So there are some weird situations where this can come up. So let's say, for example, we have our Land Raider out in the open here, and 3 intercessors have clear line of sight to him. However, 2 intercessors are partially behind the ruin and are either blocked by the ruin line of sight blocking properties, which we'll discuss later, or are blocked by the physical ruin wall to their Land Raider. In order to gain cover, a model has to be partially obscured from any model in the attacking unit. This is much easier to determine for single entity units because all you have to do is draw a line of sight from that guy to everyone in the target unit in order for them not to gain cover. But for multiple entity units like the intercessors here, if any intercessor has its line of sight blocked to any part of the Land Raider by the terrain feature, then the Land Raider is going to gain cover. So in this instance, even though these 3 intercessors are able to fire at the Land Raider clearly, because some of the intercessors are behind this terrain feature, the Land Raider is still going to benefit from cover. This makes it extremely easy for models, and especially large models like this Land Raider, to benefit from cover in 10th edition. A lot of times you'll hear people say that you're always in cover unless it's sort of explicitly described that you're not, and this is kind of the reason why. Obviously, the reverse is not necessarily the case. As we described previously, if the Land Raider was to attack the intercessors here, only these 2 intercessors would be partially obscured by the terrain feature, so only those 2 would benefit from cover, whereas the 3 in the open would take any hits assigned to them without cover being applied. Now, we've talked at length about this ruin terrain feature, and we're going to wrap up the video by talking about the ruin mechanics in particular, because it's the most important style of terrain in Warhammer 40,000. As you see here, we're on a Pariah Nexus tournament layout. That is one of the recommended terrain layouts that Games Workshop recommends for 10th edition play, and every single terrain feature on all of these layouts is a piece of ruin terrain. And this is because ruins have the greatest potential to grant cover and block line of sight and make games a little bit more dynamic and interesting. If you're playing competitively, you'll be playing almost entirely on ruins, and even in other forms of play, they're the most commonly played style of terrain anyway. Now, a piece of ruin terrain is composed of 2 separate parts. The base, or the footprint, which is essentially the area that the terrain feature takes up. Normally, you'll see that ruin terrain in person is placed on a base, usually like an MDF base, or even like a neoprene or laser cut acrylic template for them to stand on. This is essentially the area that is taken up by the terrain feature, and all the rules that apply to the terrain feature will apply to this area. So this area is where models have to be in to gain cover from the terrain feature, and this area will block line of sight by ruin blocking, which we'll discuss in a moment. The second part of the ruin is the vertical part. So typically there are 3-dimensional elements that are placed on top of the ruin terrain feature to restrict movement or to block true line of sight. These work in exactly the same way that we were discussing previously. They'll restrict movement for most unit types, and they'll block line of sight regardless of the ruin blocking that we discuss later. Some terrain features in ruins are included, allow exceptions for moving through them for particular unit keywords. In this case, ruins can be moved through by infantry and beast keyworded units. It's essentially assumed that an infantry unit like this is either going to be able to set explosives or find their way through gaps in these walls in order to traverse them, and so while moving, they don't have to pay any vertical distance to move over these styles of terrain. That said, if this was a multi-level terrain feature with a second floor, they would have to pay vertical distance if they wanted to climb to that second floor, but if just moving through the walls, they can do that for free. There are some other more specific unit keywords that can also do this. Imperium Primarchs like Robute Gilliman and Lionel Johnson can do it, as well as Belisarius Call, but those are very specific units who are called out specifically by the rule. In addition, ruins have a rule called Plunging Fire, which grants +1 AP to the weapons of models that are 6 inches above the ground level and are attacking enemies on the ground level. Essentially, you're assumed to gain a height advantage over enemies that are below you, although this very rarely comes up. Not a lot of ruin terrain features that have multiple floors actually tall enough for you to benefit from that, but in some cases it will. And when it does, it actually becomes very important. Now here I'm going to reiterate a second part about these vertical elements, and that is that they always normally block true line of sight. So regardless of all the rules that we're about to discuss with ruin line of sight blocking, these walls are still considered 3-dimensional objects that can impede lines of sight. So as we discussed previously, you're tracing lines from your miniatures to your opponent's miniatures, and those lines can't can't cross through physical solid objects. So this means that if these intercessors are hiding behind this wall, line of sight to them is always going to be blocked from models that are standing over here. Now with that, let's talk about the additional line of sight blocking characteristics of ruin footprints. Now I'm going to break down these rules directly as they're written, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more of an in-depth explanation of how they work. Models that are not wholly within the area of a ruined terrain have their line of sight automatically blocked by the footprint of that terrain to other models that are not within that same ruin. Now in this video, I'm going to call this automatic line of sight blocking capacity ruin blocking, just to separate it from normal line of sight, because they are different. As we just described, normal line of sight is blocked by the vertical elements of this terrain feature, even though the ruin line of sight blocking effect might not apply to those models. Okay, so that's a lot of words. Let's talk about exactly what this means. Essentially, this creates three distinct relationships a model can have with a piece of ruined terrain. Let's describe these by saying that we're trying to determine the line of sight between this Gravis Captain and this Land Raider, and we're going to draw from the Gravis Captain. The first state you can be in is that you are not within the terrain feature. This means that the line of sight between the two models gets ruin blocked by the footprint of the terrain, so line of sight in this case can't be drawn. If any line between these models would cross over this footprint, so it automatically gets blocked by the ruin rule. The second state is that you are partially within the ruin terrain feature. As long as you're not wholly within it, the ruin will block line of sight from you, so this Captain in Gravis armor would not be able to trace line of sight to this Land Raider because of the ruin blocking rule. You have to be wholly within it for the ruin to stop blocking your line of sight. However, models can trace line of sight to enemies within ruins, and that line of sight is just traced normally. So in this case, the Land Raider would have clear line of sight to the Gravis Captain because he's partially within it. Lastly, you can be wholly within the terrain feature. In this case, there's no ruin blocking whatsoever. Your line of sight can be traced freely outside of the ruined terrain as long as you satisfy all the other requirements, so you're not trying to draw the line of sight through a solid object, for example. But on the flip side, enemies can see you. In addition, ruins also grant cover to units that are wholly within them, so you will automatically gain cover from the ruin as well. However, it is also possible to gain cover from ruins by being partially obscured by being outside of them. For example, a model tracing their line of sight to the Gravis Captain from this area would be partially obscured, and you can also be just touching the area of the terrain, but still be partially obscured by vertical elements like walls and gain cover that way. So to reiterate, if both you and the target are not within the area of the ruin, then line of sight gets blocked to you if it traces over the ruin. If only one of the models is inside the ruin, line of sight can be traced into the ruin, but not out of it. And if one or both of the models are wholly within the ruin, then you can draw a line of sight normally. Kind of tangentially, this also means that if both models are partially within the ruin, then they can see each other normally, because the ruin stops blocking your line of sight to each other if you're both partially within it, although that kind of rarely comes up. We're going to bring Magnus back here because we're going to talk about very large models that use base measurement. Models like Magnus the Red here have outstretched parts that can interact with this rule in a pretty interesting way. You aren't considered to be within a ruin until your base is overlapping the footprint of that ruin. So in this case, Magnus would be considered to be within the ruin because he's within the area of the terrain feature. But if his base is outside it, then he's not, because the base is the only thing that matters for measuring in relation to this miniature. However, since line of sight is traced to or from any part of the model, you can create some situations where line of sight can still be traced around the ruin. Now, first of all, if he's not within the area of the ruined terrain, the line of sight traced over the edges of the ruined terrain will still be blocked to him, even if you're trying to trace line of sight to portions of his model that are stretching over his base. In this situation, I like to think of ruins as a big box that's sort of tinted from the outside unless your base overlaps it. So even if we have a model like Magnus whose bits and pieces are outstretching over the ruin, the outside of the box is still tinted, and because his base isn't touching it, then the line of sight into it gets blocked. However, as soon as he goes to overlap the area of that ruin, that tinting turns off and you can suddenly draw a line of sight to him through that ruin just fine. Now, in addition to that, because line of sight gets traced to and from any part of your miniature, you can choose to trace it from parts of the miniature that are on the opposite side of a terrain feature. So say for example, we have Magnus the Red over here, and we can kind of see where that two-dimensional measurement ends up with our shadows in Tabletop Simulator here. So for example, we have a model with a big outstretched piece like Magnus the Red over here that's able to stretch across the ruin terrain, and we want to see our Gravis Captain friend over here. Now in this case, we're drawing line of sight from the point on his spear that is not overlapping the ruin terrain, and because the terrain only blocks lines of sight that are traced over it, this is totally, so we can trace our line of sight from this point in order to sort of skirt the rule. However, keep in mind that incoming line of sight, so from our Gravis Captain, could also be traced in the same way. So if Magnus had his spear oriented like this, the line of sight would be blocked because it passes over the footprint of the terrain. But if Magnus had his spear like this, he can draw line of sight from the tip of the spear, which is not overlapping the ruined terrain, and that's totally fine. However, enemies can also draw line of sight back to him in that way. This might seem like a little bit of a cheat for these big models, but it is kind of a catch-22 because it allows you to get more easy line of sight, but also enemies can draw line of sight more easily to you. And a lot of the official terrain layouts for Pry and Nexus are actually designed with this in mind. They have a lot of corners and things like this where models can poke out or just barely nudge their line of sight to get line of sight around ruins and allow them to interact with the other army without moving super far. Now, last but certainly not least, two specific unit keywords have a totally unique interaction with this mechanic, those being aircraft and towering units, things like big knights and other titans. Aircraft, first of all, totally ignore this rule entirely. They basically just forget that the ruin blocking rule exists. If they are not in hover mode, once they're in hover mode, they lose the aircraft keyword, so they don't get any of these rules. But if they're not in hover mode, then they can both see over ruin terrain features and be seen over ruin terrain features normally. They just revert to only using the true line of sight rules. So all models will use the true line of sight rules, but also have the additional rider that they can't trace their line of sight over the template of the ruin terrain. Aircraft just don't have that second part. They can just trace their line of sight over the ruin template as long as their target isn't blocked by walls or things like that. They will still benefit from cover, and since most ruins will have some sort of vertical element on the base, it's very easy for aircraft to gain cover, which is a little idiosyncratic and probably an unintended consequence of the rules. However, it's much easier for them to ignore the cover of enemy models because they don't get it automatically by hiding behind a ruin, and it's much easier for them to gain line of sight. Just keep in mind that if you have opponents hiding behind a physical wall or something, the aircraft will still have to see them. It's also worth, I think, reiterating here that aircraft back to those line of sight models is also determined normally, so they can't hide behind ruins like other models can by hiding behind the footprint. If you can see them with true line of sight, you can still attack them. Towering units, on the other hand, have a much simpler relationship. Essentially, they don't need to be wholly within a ruin terrain feature to see through it. They just have to be within it. So as long as the tiniest part of their base is overlapping over the ruin terrain, then they're going to ignore the ruin blocking to and from that terrain feature. They're going to be able to trace their line of sight through it, and they're also going to be able to be seen through it. But it's an important thing to keep in mind because sometimes you can be surprised by knights and other big, fast, towering units getting line of sight to your models simply by touching a terrain feature that other unit types wouldn't normally be able to gain access to. Keep in mind, however, on the flip side, that at that point they are also within the terrain feature, so line of sight to them can be traced normally as well. They also gain all of the same cover benefits that normal units do, so as long as they can partially obscure themselves behind a terrain feature like this, for example, they'll gain cover when being attacked from behind that terrain feature. And with that, those are all of the line of sight and ruin rules in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section if there are any additional questions about these. I know these rules are very complicated, but they are maybe some of the most important rules to understand, especially when playing 40k at a competitive level. With that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, big shout out to my YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. And don't forget to check out the Ides of March in the link down in the video description. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.